From TPN at technophilespodcast.com, I'm Krista-Lee, and this is Sci-Fi Science.
It's interesting that at the end of the day, sometimes I think what the longing is about governance. It's about legitimate authority. Who should be in charge?
On this episode of Sci-Fi Science, we talk about Ernest Cline's book, Ready Player One, with special guest Dr. Thomas Malaby. Grease up your haptic suit because this is Sci-Fi Science's second episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sci-Fi Science. This month I am joined again by Patrick Tomlinson, and this month we also have a special guest, Thomas Malaby. Patrick, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good.
I almost died yesterday.
So. Well, I'm glad to see you made it here then. Why did you almost die? Are you going to share?
Nah.
All right,
just going to leave it there. So
fine. You're
all lucky to have me. Fine. Moving on.
Good. Forget you. More importantly, we have Thomas Malaby today. Thomas is a professor at UW-Milwaukee. He was my advisor. He was an excellent advisor.
Oh, thank you.
And he is also a games scholar, which is why we have him here today. Thomas, how are you?
I'm doing great, Krista-Lee.
Have you done anything interesting recently?
Start 2 new classes in the same semester. Haven't done that for a very long time.
Ooh.
Makes me feel young again as a professor. That's a high demand kind of thing.
What classes?
So one is a class on post-war attitudes toward technology in the United States at the Honors College at UW-Milwaukee.
Which
wow,
war?
That sounds heavy.
Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Which war?
The post-World War II.
Okay. We've had one every 10 years or so.
It's like clockwork. It's you could set your watch to it.
We get bored.
And then the other class is a graduate seminar on anthropology, the discipline, and the digital, how it's trying to figure out ways to understand the digital aspects of our lives.
Why couldn't you start that when I was still a student?
I know.
That sounds fantastic.
I'm filling in for Cal Applebaum while he's on sabbatical, so it's given me the chance to teach that advanced seminar. You can sit in. You're welcome to come by Friday mornings.
Ooh, you lost me at morning.
Oh.
She doesn't have to get up in the morning anymore.
I remember those days.
Maybe I will make an attempt at coming down sometime.
You can choose the weeks that interest you. I'll send you the syllabus.
That sounds great. I would love that. All right. Well, the reason I have asked Thomas here today is because we're talking about Ready Player One, and perhaps Patrick can give us a spoiler-free-ish synopsis of Ready Player One, so now it makes sense why we're talking all this games.
Sure, absolutely. Ready Player One, camera A, camera B. There we are. Ready Player One is a novel that came out in 2011 by Ernest Cline. He lives in L.A. He's a screenwriter as well as a novelist and a spoken word artist. This was actually his debut novel. It centers around, early 20s kid named Wade. He spends most of his time in a complete construct universe run by a system called the Oasis, which is like Facebook, except you can actually see and touch everyone. So the Oasis is simply a large or virtual reality environment that spans light years. It goes off in every direction. So you can get lost in there. And when the book starts, indeed, nearly the entire human population has gotten lost in there for the last decade or so. At the heart of the Oasis is a contest in which the Oasis's creator has hidden a series of keys and portals that would allow the winner of the contest to take over his vast multi-billion-dollar fortune and control of the Oasis itself. So, heck of a startup for it. Really good place to start with this, and the book has an awful lot to say about the way we're living our lives today in this shared space with both the real world and the virtual world. And on top of that, even though this book is a few years old, we decided to talk about it now because it's been optioned by Steven Spielberg to be his next movie. And its principal principal shooting starts really soon. In fact, I think they've already started casting for several roles in Atlanta, if I remember the reports correctly. So this will be coming to the silver screen very soon, and if everybody plays ball with it, which is going to be a really big problem, which I think we'll talk about later, it will be absolutely spectacular. So that's the spoiler-free summary.
Yeah, actually, the one thing that I wonder about with the movie option before we start talking about the story real quick is there's so much copyrighted stuff all over this story, and if you just took it all out, I think it would really lose a lot of the appeal.
The whole idea behind the contest is that the creator of the Oasis grew up in the 80s and early 90s. That was his formative years. And so he has a deep knowledge and appreciation of everything from that era, whether it be the video games as they were just coming up through the arcades and the early console systems, or to the music, to the movies and the TV shows. It's just across just anything 80s is so completely suffused throughout this book. And so I was born in 80. I had a couple of months worth of Carter's administration before we moved on, but so I was coming of age at about the time that the most of the pop culture references of this book are set in. So like I'm myself and you for certain are directly the target demographic for the massive amounts of nostalgia that simply permeate this book.
That's interesting to hear. I mean, I'm 48, and I was thinking, boy, I'm the target demographic.
Okay, well, yeah. it's one generation, and there's only 13 years between us. So
well, that's right, and it spans a pretty wide range, right? If you're talking about everything from a game like Pac-Man from the mid 1970s through games in the late 80s, that's a wide range.
Well, and for as far as like the movies and stuff, they were talking about all the way up to the Matrix in '99 and the early 2000s. Right. So right. It spanned that whole length.
And even
sorry, I was just going to say, as far as the property question is concerned, there is an example that we could look at, which is Toy Story. Toy Story rather famously needed permission from a lot of toy manufacturers in order to tell this realistic story about the toys that are found. And Barbie, if I recall correctly, I haven't read into it, but if I recall correctly, Mattel for Barbie didn't really want to join in. There was a lot of hesitation on their part, but ultimately they did. And if you think of it from an industry point of view, there's a lot to be gained from participating in something that would spark a lot of broad interest and participation in your area. So maybe.
Yeah, seriously, it's a free commercial.
Right.
So,
it's a free commercial, and I think when you've got so many, because like this book, like if Toy Story is going to be the model for it, this book takes it to such a ridiculous level beyond that, as far as the number of different artists and directors and game designers and authors and actors and musicians and everybody that you'd have to get on board with this. That I would. If they do it right, and Steven Spielberg's the person to do it right because he has enough influence, that I think it would kind of get to a point where it would snowball and just be like, okay, well, these other 750,000 people are okay with this, so why are you holding out on us? Right. So that's my hope, at least.
That makes sense.
I think so. I'm not too worried about it, but I could see it causing some. Oh
God, I want it to work because it will be just spectacular. Like some of the fight scenes at the end of the book would be absolutely spectacular.
Truly.
So since we have you here, Thomas, I want to add. There is actually something I really want to ask you about this.
Okay.
So Oasis, of course, started as an MMORPG. It evolves into this bigger virtual reality beyond the game space.
For those of you who don't know what an MMORPG, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Who am I kidding?
Really, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game.
I'm joking. It's okay.
All right.
They all know. It's all right.
I'm sure. You derailed my train of
I
thought.
apologize.
No, okay. So the first thing I thought of was the work you had done with Second Life.
Right.
And I was wondering if you can speak to that.
Oh, you think there's a parallel between the Oasis and Second Life in some way?
I think there was a desire for Second Life to be a parallel to Oasis.
Oh, for sure. And even listed in the book at one point are a bunch of the precursor kind of models in fiction and elsewhere for what Oasis was to become. And it's all part of the sort of inspiration set, you might say, for people of a particular generation. For Linden Lab, the makers of Second Life, there was no question that the metaverse from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash or the similar virtual worlds in William Gibson's writings and the like were all very much what they were trying to produce. In fact, they would outright say they were trying to make the metaverse. So they were going into it, unlike something like World of Warcraft or EverQuest and the like. They were going into it with the idea that it would be the next internet. It would be the next three-dimensional internet in which people would spend their lives. Their Second Life was supposed to be where your life would be. And that's certainly what is achieved by Oasis here in this text. So it comes from the same place of hope, the same project, the same goals as something like Second Life, for sure.
Well, and I think that the reason it works, at least from a narrative position within Ready Player One, is that the real world, the first life, at the point that this book starts taking place, is so desolate and without hope that it would allow something like Oasis or Second Life or the metaverse that you're referring to really take root and become preferable. Because this is a world that's been ravaged by climate change, an energy crisis, economic collapse. All things that, if project forward, I think this takes place in 2040, early 2040, something like that.
Yeah.
So if you project some of these trends forward, it could very easily be something that we'd be facing in the next 30 years. Although some of the news that's come out of clean energy, solar and wind, and the way they're finally starting to beat coal and natural gas economically, not just environmentally, are some positive signs. But within the confines of this book, it would be very easy to see why someone would turn entirely away from the world, because there's just nothing for them.
Yeah, definitely. I aside from the energy stuff that you mentioned, I mean, granted, obviously, I hope that all works out. But
it's gonna be fine.
Well, they talk about being in, I want to say, the third decade of the Great Recession in the book. Have we crawled out of the one that we've had my whole adult life now?
Collectively, yes.
Really?
But as far as...
I mean, I haven't, so...
Well, which is why I say collectively, because as a country, as a whole, we have. I mean, the economy is... all the economic indicators are moving in the right direction. Our unemployment's down below 5% again. Our deficit is dropped by more than 2/3 at this point, compared to what it was just a few years ago. The stock market has more than recovered all of its losses, and in fact, it was almost tripled. But that doesn't mean that individually, the majority of people are doing better. The middle class continues to shrink. We're not seeing much in the way of wage growth to match all of this additional income that continues to flow towards the top couple of percent. Companies are still worried about their paying out their dividends, and they're worried about stock prices not returning anything to their employees, which works fine in the short term, but has a rather detrimental effect to demand over the long term. So there's still the potential for us to dip back into that recession in a very, very real and lasting way.
From this point of view, intellectually, I understand why everything you mentioned matters, but on a real day-to-day basis, half of what you said is completely irrelevant.
No, it's irrelevant.
Stock market bounces
no,
back.
It's irrelevant, and it's irrelevant to individuals, and it's irrelevant to people who haven't been able to, play into that. And the fact that income and productivity became completely uncoupled in the 1970s and have not, linked back up since then. The fact that we're working longer hours and taking less vacation and are actually significantly more productive and more profitable for our employers than we ever have been in all of human history, and yet have not gotten a raise in 40 years, yeah, that's a problem that needs to be addressed at some point in the near future.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence, really. I mean, that we end up having this kind of conversation as we think about the world that's imagined in the novel. Science fiction, one could argue, was born of this modern anxiety. Mm-hmm. The anxiety of, where is modern life leading? I mean, way back even into the 19th century, and certainly, obviously, George Orwell and books like 1984 and the like. Where is this going? How are we going to pull this off? The idea that things are spinning out of control and that will lead to some kind of cataclysmic consequence is a very long-running dimension of what science fiction is all about. So it's in this. I think it's been with us for a long time.
So I want to ask you now, so a part of this dystopic scene that we have in Ready Player One is the idea of the oasis as an escape.
Yes.
And then I know we briefly mentioned it before the show, but I'm going to bring it up again for the show. Morrow.
For anyone who isn't in the studio audience here.
Right. Morrow, who is the character who was the business partner of Holiday. Holiday's the one with the contest. He makes reference at one point, I think it's supposed to be during a media interview, on how the Oasis has become an escape and that humans have given up on their actual society, which is collapsing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this idea of the Oasis as an escape.
Which is why he turned on the Oasis as a concept, actually, because it became, even though it was something that he helped to create, he came to realize later that it was allowing people not to address their own problems.
Right, and I'm not so sure that's what was going on, which is why I bring up the question. So what do you think?
I think two things primarily come to mind. One is this contrast that pervades our thinking about technology and society today between leisure and work, the unproductive and the productive. And that's a distinction that has arisen with modern times. It really is not one observed by many cultures and societies around the world for most of human history. So we have that as a tension. There's a kind of demand, a morally charged demand that we be productive, that's carried along inside modernity and capitalism and all of those things that we exist within.
Well, especially here in American culture.
Right.
Our work ethic is psychotic.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of roots and a lot of very interesting roots here about in the Protestant ethic and the imperative to apply yourself in this world, to better this world and reveal or help contribute to a glorious plan, originally as a religious idea. So that's part of this question for sure. But I think also there's lingering in there the idea that if there's no hope, if people, according to the conventional institutions that they're living under, governments and private companies, if people have ceased to hope for their own betterment, for the opportunity to get ahead, opportunity to provide for their children, then that, in a much more personal way, leads to a position of despair, for which escape seems to be the only option. Some kind of momentary relief from that kind of suffering, the model for which is certainly in the modern era drug addiction, right? So that games come to occupy something like the position of drugs as the path to escaping the suffering of the everyday.
Or gambling is another really good example,
right?
Because that buys you hope. That $2 Powerball ticket when we're at $1.3 billion or whatever that last one was. Like that. So that's buying you $2 worth of hope.
That's exactly right. There's actually a wonderful book about state lotteries called Selling Hope. Yeah, you named it exactly right.
I think the Oasis is more than that, though. This is more... I mean, I get the lottery reference, okay? But when you look at the main character, he goes to school inside the Oasis.
Right.
And his mom, or even before that, when he's younger, his mom's working 2 jobs, and so he logs into the Oasis, And not that I'm advocating that a video game should be your babysitter, but they have all these educational games, and he talks about being raised inside an interactive Sesame Street, for example.
Well, and he works in Oasis. Like, his job, he has a cubicle within the, like, he has to log into to the Oasis to go to his office where he sits, and then he handles customer service calls for the Oasis. You know, like so it's both an escape, but it's also like he spends a significant amount of his time in the Oasis being productive, although, you know, within a certain definition of the word productive, I suppose. But yeah, so it's gotten to the point where and Second Life achieved that quite well too, where it's like, okay, this isn't even just escape. Like, I'm literally working on this thing.
Right.
I'm literally earning real money on this thing.
And that's actually, I think, a very big story, and a big piece of this novel is the idea that something that from one angle perhaps originally is seen as outside of a leisure activity, something separate from what is supposed to be the meaningful or productive things that occupy our time, becomes or holds out the hope for being the place that actually could be where you do everything, where your work and your play could be integrated, and where you have reduced so many costs and so many constraints that creativity will flow easily and innovation will flow more easily. There's within these kinds of technologies that kind of hope. Yeah, well,
but then not be rewarded financially, which, you know, being a full-time sci-fi author and comedian has some bearing on my life.
For sure, and that's the specter of one of the, essentially the villain, the villainous institution in this book is just the kind of organization that is exploitive, that will not serve the purpose of.
And then all that creativity that is created by that leisure time is completely devalued because everyone's doing it, and there's no way to quantify it, and there's no way to, because it's just all freely available, because everybody's hopeless and just puts the stuff out there without having any sense of hope that their work and their creativity and their intellectual property is going to be rewarded in any way. So they just put it out there for other people to enjoy.
Right, and consider the fact that we're talking about an imagined system, and Second Life was very much built on these kinds of ideas, where the users are supposed to have all the freedom they need, all the tools they need to be as creative as they would ever want to be. But that obscures the fact that you're creative within a system that is controlled by another institution. So in this novel, I don't want to give anything away, but part of what's at stake is who controls Oasis, who controls this system. It's put forth to us, for whatever its good and bad aspects, at least its owners at the time that the novel begins are not themselves exploitive.
No, the two, I mean, at the very beginning, they seem to be very altruistic. But I don't think it would give away too much to talk about IOI, do you? As far as the...
I don't think so. We can always add the earmuffs later.
Anyway, so what Thomas was referring to, Mr. Thomas, I'm sorry, Professor Thomas, boy, I'm just really screwing that up. What he was referring to is that during the contest, there's the main character and a group of his friends are trying to solve all the different puzzles, but they are being constantly hounded by a large, very well funded, very well equipped group that all works for one corporation that really, really, really wants to get control of the Oasis. It's in its entirety, and they will go to some pretty extreme lengths in order to achieve that end, because we're talking about not just the original fortune of several hundred billions of dollars, I believe, but then also control of the single largest computer and internet network on the planet that covers several billions of people, and all of their commerce and all of their employment and all of their transactions and all of their lives.
And they're completely open about this. There's no sense that IOI is trying to hide what they're doing. They say,
they're like, no, we want this.
Yeah, they talk about, there's one line in there where they talk about how the Oasis has been improperly monetized. And they are going to rectify this problem in order to...
Big problem.
Make money. Yeah, heaven forbid anything should be, available to everybody.
Well, and it's not just that part of it. In fact, I was having a conversation with another author friend of mine, Brad Bollier, who lives down in further south in Wisconsin, and we were talking about the fact that in the very near future, virtual intelligence or even rudimentary artificial intelligence will be able to take over basically any non-creative job you can possibly imagine, whether it be automated through actual robots with VI or automated through VI programs, as far as like management level positions. We will not have jobs in the next. We won't have jobs in the next 30 years. Robots or VI programs will be capable of doing basically everything, and so the whole concept of what work is and the whole concept of what employment is. And how people earn a living. Like we're going, as an entire human society, not just this country, not just this capitalist, block of countries, but the entire human society is going to have to rethink pretty seriously what work means and what productivity means, because we won't be needed for the mundane stuff. We're going to be needed for. We're going to be needed for service jobs, face-to-face jobs. We're going to be needed for creative fields.
Interestingly enough, Star Trek is built on one attempt at a solution to that very problem. What should a post-scarcity world and society look like?
Well, and in Next Generation, I know there's one episode that I can't remember the number of at the moment, but Picard runs into somebody from a capitalist society, and this person doesn't understand how a society functions without money. And they even say, why does anybody work? How do you get people to work? And he says, well, we work for the betterment of ourselves and humankind. And that's it.
That's one of the first season episodes. There was like 3 or 4 people that got thawed out from the 21st century or something like that. Yeah, I remember that one.
I don't actually think this is very realistic because, going back to the Powerball, okay, I bought a few tickets. And I have a couple of friends. We all will buy tickets and talk about, what we want to do. And here's the irony. We all want to win the lottery so that we can work. But we want to do it so that we can work doing the things that we want to do. All 3 of us would, in fact, be more productive if we had the means to not do the other jobs that all of us do just for money on the side.
I've been very fortunate over the last few years that I spent more than a decade selling health insurance and recruiting health insurance agents. And that has left me with a fairly considerable secondary passive income through renewals and so forth. And if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for that money that was coming in without me, that I already earned years ago, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be an author. I wouldn't be a comedian. I would not have had the time necessary to put into those purely intellectual pursuits.
Yeah, I know. I've been jealous of you since the day I met you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right. Which is not to say that I don't like teaching, because I actually really, really like teaching.
She hates teaching.
No, but I actually feel that, and maybe it's just because I live in Wisconsin, I don't feel that it's a viable career. I can't.
I don't know what would lead you to Act 10.
I don't feel like I could support myself being a teacher. But that's one of the things that has come up, and that I've talked to with my friends and family when the whole lottery discussion comes up. I would still want to be so active in universities. There are things I want to do. There's talks I want to give. There's books I want to write. There's all these things that I want to do to contribute to academia, but I can't afford to be productive. So we have talked about most of the things that were really tickling me about this book, but Thomas, what stuck out to you?
Well, one of the things that I often think about when I read science fiction that's about these kinds of topics, virtual worlds and games and the rest, is this deep longing that they have. They're very, very romantic in one way or another. And it's interesting that at the end of the day, sometimes I think what the longing is about governance. It's about legitimate authority. Who should be in charge? Who can we trust to be in charge? A longing for a system that gives us someone or some institution that we can feel good about, that has that political legitimacy, which is the most important thing for any government that has ever existed. Well, in this book, you have a suggested solution to that is in fact a very old one. It's one that goes back to ancient Greece. It's the idea of the philosopher king. In the book, there is this contest, and the contest is going to award someone a vast amount of governing control. And implicit in that is the idea that the person we want ruling us is not just the best gamer out there, it's the most enlightened best gamer out there. And that means shutting down a whole bunch of other alternatives, including, for example, democracy, right? So there's an idea in here that, well, if we could just have that benevolent monarch, the benevolent dictator figure, the philosopher king, that would be the path out of this very intransigent, intractable situation where people are living and suffering under terrible circumstances.
But there were some democratic elements to it, because although ultimately Parzival, which is his Oasis, is the character's Oasis name, is the one to ultimately win it. He wins it on the back of the efforts of a massive army of people that assembled to fight for him, to give him the chance. And that's a method of voting, I suppose.
But now I suppose we're in full-on earmuffs territory. But
yeah,
sure.
We'll bring that icon up. So let's just delve all into the spoilers now.
But consider the fact that he promises to share what he receives, but once we realize that what he's receiving is not simply a large amount of cash, but it is in fact a control position, there is not another word about sharing that. He is the new wizard, right? And in that sense,
he shares the money, but he doesn't share the responsibility.
Right. Yeah. He's the one with access to, here's a big spoiler in my opinion, the off button for the whole thing, right? Which is
the off button, the kill switches on any character or any avatar, like all that stuff. Yeah.
And anyone who's really interested in this as an aspect of virtual worlds should absolutely rush to read Julian DeBell's My Tiny Life, which is about Lambda Mu, a very early virtual world, a text-based one, where, guess what? The wizards are in charge, and the wizards are benevolent, and the wizards are the people who have the off switch, and they can do the permabans and all the rest. But eventually, that's not a workable and legitimate system. First, for one thing, it demands an enormous amount of time from this wizard figure who will never ever sleep if they're called upon to do this all the time. And once they're gone, who's the next one? And how do we know there's someone we can trust?
Yeah, because how do you maintain benevolence over generations?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a classic question.
And in that example in Julian's book, he talks about how there is a time when the wizards, and I don't remember the guy's name, but tries to be hands off, and he goes, "Okay, I'm not going to deal with this. Right. You need to deal with it yourself." But then that doesn't really work either. It doesn't work.
Right. And that takes us back to this issue of contrived systems, that our lives are increasingly taking place within systems that are privately produced, privately designed, and privately controlled, and that's something very different from an architected built environment life where the government is controlling the spaces through which we lead our public lives.
We could probably earmuffs off now. Probably.
But to the responsibility thing, if I remember correctly, I think H doesn't seem interested in it, right? Or not H, you know what I'm thinking of? Artemis. Artemis, she wants to get this money and then do all this charity work. I'm sorry. There's always one mic I hit. And H actually H doesn't really seem interested in it either. They're both just people who are looking for a way out of their circumstance. They want the money.
Right.
And so it actually kind of makes sense that he wouldn't have had to offer to share.
Yeah, Shoto really didn't care either from the way it's felt at the end of the book. But
well, I think it's not there because there's no way to solve it. I think that the key point in the story where you need more than one person to do something to make things move forward is very much a statement about the collective and not the individual. But I think given that, there's no way to resolve that, keep that, and sustain that through the end when he's given that responsibility to himself. So I think if these three other figures were people who didn't really want that kind of authority, I think that would have been the story told to us. But instead, it's not dealt with.
Fair enough.
It's a thought.
Yeah.
Honestly, I hadn't really thought too hard about the responsibility factor, but again, coming from a not rich background, I was just sitting there like, yeah, man, if I won that money, and this is what I would be doing, and that is really cool.
I thought for sure he was going to hit the kill switch at the end.
Really?
Yep. I thought the message of the book was, this is ultimately an obstacle, and he's come to understand that this world is ultimately an obstacle to human flourishing, much like WALL-E, right? Where in WALL-E, they're in this vehicle, and they have everything they could ever want except meaningful lives.
So I definitely see where you're coming from on that. I didn't think he was going to do that. I guess I was expecting kind of where the book actually went, where I was expecting this, we're going to save this oasis, his world, but I guess I was thinking like bringing it in balance, and now I'm like evoking the Force
I can
here.
see narratively why that would be a satisfying ending of him just pushing the big red button, but
True, yes.
but at the same time, for trying to make that realistic at all, I mean, so much of that world's and society's economy and educational system, I mean, it was just so integrated at that point that the level of disruption that would have represented would have been catastrophic.
It would have been. But the suggestions of that as the recommended course of action are there all along through the whole book. From Og and from other figures.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. Well, we are about out of time. So on the way out, why don't you, we'll start with Patrick. Do you think this is where the world's actually going? Is this our future?
No, because I don't buy into the dystopian nonsense. I really don't. I just even over, and I've been saying this for a number of years, and some of the more alarmist people within my friends groups have always been kind of dismissive of me because they're always latching onto the next global warming catastrophe thing that's coming down the pipeline, but. Like as I had said earlier in the broadcast, solar and wind are cheaper than coal now, and that's all from this point forward. When we build new when we build new electrical capacity, it's going to be green, and not for environmental reasons, but for economic reasons. So these problems are solving themselves, and us as human beings, we're pretty damn good over the long term. Not the short term, but over the long term, we're pretty good at sorting this sort of thing out. So I don't think that we're going to find ourselves in this situation where that large of a chunk of the population is going to feel that desperate for escape. I think that we will certainly have I think that something like the Oasis or something like Second Life was going to come along and have a much larger influence over the way we work and the way we live, if only for telecommunication or telepresence purposes, because I think the days of building these gigantic office buildings that we have to heat and cool, just so people can drive their cars 30 miles each way, just sit there for no reason in clothes that they didn't really have to wear and didn't really have to have dry cleaned, so they could get up an hour early for that extra 2 hours of commute time. Those telecommuting, for God's sakes, thanks. Anyway, so yeah, I think that I think that those days are going to come to a close again for economic reasons, because companies will no longer be able to, even these big organizations that are so conservative, they're just not going to be able to ignore the economic sense of letting people telecommute anymore. And so something like the Oasis is going to have to come along.
Okay. What do you think, Thomas? When do I get my Oasis?
Well, I think we will have these kinds of systems. We may have one of these kinds of systems eventually, but I suppose if the broader question is, will we go through a period of terrible, kind of dystopic period of terrible, calamitous upheaval, I tend to think not. I'd like to think not. Maybe on my better days, I think not. I think we are in a moment where we're trying to find our way towards something John Dewey called for about 70 years ago, which is now that we've figured out how to create a peaceful and stable society that domesticates or keeps under control a certain kind of competition over scarce resources, he says, Now we're past that. We have abundance. So now our next challenge is, how do we have a peaceful, flourishing society built on something other than a model of competition over scarce resources? And I think that is the central question of our times. And part of the solution means moving away from this romance of the individual, which we're still in the midst of. But I feel, on my better days again, like I glimpse the horizon of that, and that we're going to move out from under this valorization of individual innovation, and we will rediscover what we can do together. I hope so.
Well, I definitely would be fine with a future in which we have like the Star Trek ethos oasis. Definitely
and I feel like that's really empowering to the individual. Not dismissive of it.
Yes, but it's a different conception. I mean, right now we have a system that's built on the idea that, not that all of us pursue this, but the engine of it is very much built upon the idea of someone getting ahead at someone else's expense.
Right, and that's the precept of competition. But once that's past that, when you get into a Star Trek like society where you're not worried about money, that's a very empowering society that allows individuals to pursue their own passions and talents.
Right, the individual would not disappear.
Right,
certainly, but we'd find the balance again. Is my hope.
I agree, but I would still like it if I could visit people in the oasis rather than leaving my house, Wisconsin, in January and February, unless, of course, global warming does come, in which case I might like living here.
I'm rooting for it. I mean, we're 600 feet above sea level here.
We got plenty of water.
We got all sorts of fresh water. I'd be able to ride my motorcycle year round. There's really no downside. There is no downside to global warming.
All right, so we know we are very lucky being here in Wisconsin. Thank you both for being with me here tonight, especially Thomas for braving the cold to come hang out with us. Thank you to everybody for watching. And I looked at Patrick and said Thomas. Thomas, if people would like to tweet you about Second Life and games and books, and where can they find you?
I am on Twitter at TMMALABY at TMMalaby. I am on Facebook. I think those are pretty much the only social media I do.
Okay.
But you can find me. Send me a tweet.
And Patrick, if they can start, if anyone would like to start an argument with you about how everything is going to hell in a handbasket, where can they find you?
I will block them. But if you want to try, you can find me on Twitter at StealthyGeek. You can find me on Facebook at just Patrick Tomlinson, TOMLINSON.
And I am Krista-Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at GamerAnthro. And this has been Sci-Fi Science, a part of the Technophiles podcast network. And you can also find us and some of our other lovely shows at www.technophilespodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Technophiles Pod and on Twitter at Sci-Fi Science TPN. Thank you.
Good night.